Everyone laughed when he dragged it home. A mountain of rust. A corpse of iron. They said he'd finally gone mad. But Thomas Hale didn't answer. He just kept walking beside the truck, dust rising behind the tires like smoke from a dying fire. The sun was cruel that morning. The kind of heat that cracked paint, split wood, and tested patience. The convoy crawled down the valley road, slow as a funeral. Children ran barefoot, pointing and giggling. Men leaned on fences, chewing tobacco, whispering jokes that carried easily on the wind. "Hey, Tom, you gonna plow with that thing? Maybe he'll build himself a railroad to nowhere." Laughter burst like gunfire. Thomas didn't turn his head. The wind carried the sound away, but not the sting. He had been mocked before, droughts, failed harvests, debts, but never like this. This was public spectacle. A farmer hauling home a dead locomotive. The thing filled the road like a fallen giant. 2 trucks strained beneath its weight, chains screeching, engines whining. Even in pieces, the machine looked alive, immense, wounded, proud. Sunlight glinted off what little metal remained clean, flashing like an eye that refused to close. When they finally reached his land, the drivers cursed softly and unhooked the chains. The last section of the boiler crashed down into the field beside the barn. The earth shuddered. Dust rose like a sigh. Silence followed, the kind of silence that always comes after disbelief. Thomas wiped his hands on his jeans. Sweat ran down his temples, catching in the creases of his sunburned face. He looked small beside the iron carcass, but something in his eyes made him seem larger. Not pride. Not defiance. Conviction. His brother George arrived by noon. Saw the wreck. Laughed until tears shone in his beard. "Lord help you, Tom," he said between wheezes. "You've finally lost it. Can't feed the cows, so you bought yourself a train." Thomas didn't smile. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Or maybe I bought time." George kicked at a wheel. Rust flaked off like old bark. The nephews scrambled up the boiler, shouting, pretending to pull levers that no longer moved. Their laughter echoed across the yard. It was the only sound. That night, when everyone had gone and the field lay still under a thin veil of stars, Thomas went back outside. The barn door creaked behind him. The smell of hay and oil mixed with the cool scent of iron. He stood before the locomotive, black silhouette against a silver sky. For a long moment, he just stared. Every dent, every scar told a story of years and storms. It was a ruin, yes, but a ruin that had endured. Like him. He laid his hand on the metal. It was still warm from the sun. Beneath his palm, he imagined he could feel a faint pulse, not real, but remembered. He whispered almost without sound, "I'm not done. And neither are you." The valley slept while he stood there, tracing the outlines of the past with rough fingers. He thought of all the years the machine must have traveled, mountains, deserts, cities, before being stripped, abandoned, forgotten. Once it had carried men and dreams across the continent. Now it sat in a farmer's field, dismissed as scrap. But he saw something else. He saw endurance disguised as decay. He saw purpose waiting under rust. When he finally turned to go, the moon had risen above the barn. Its pale light caught on the curves of the boiler, making it gleam faintly, not dead, just sleeping. Thomas stopped at the door and looked back one last time. "Tomorrow," he said. No one heard him. Inside, the kettle hissed on the stove, echoing the whisper of steam he had not yet made. He sat at his worn table, hands still trembling from the day. He thought of the auction, the mocking faces, the slamming gavel, the laughter that followed him down the street. Sold to Mr. Hale. The words had sounded like a sentence then. Now they sounded like a promise. He closed his eyes. Saw the valley in his mind, gossiping, doubting, certain he'd failed. He didn't blame them. They couldn't see what he saw. They hadn't lived enough years wrestling the land to recognize a kindred stubbornness in cold metal. Outside, coyotes cried in the hills. Somewhere in the distance, an old fence groaned in the wind. Thomas rose, poured himself one last cup of coffee, and stepped to the window. The silhouette of the locomotive loomed in the dark, immense, patient, unyielding. He smiled. Just a small, tired smile. Tomorrow, the laughter would start again. But so would he. And the wind, the same wind that carried every cruel word, would one day carry a different sound. The hiss of steam. The call of a whistle. The voice of a man who refused to stop. The valley laughed again the next morning. By then, everyone knew. Old Hale's polishing ghosts, they said. But Thomas didn't hear them anymore. He had work to do. He woke before dawn. The air was cold enough to bite. He lit the stove, drank his coffee black, and stepped outside. Mist hung low over the fields, thick and grey. The locomotive waited, silent, dark, patient. A giant with its breath held. Thomas carried a bucket, brushes, rags, oil. Tools of a man who fixes things the world has already buried. The first strike of wire against iron screamed in the stillness. Sparks danced like fireflies. Rust fell in flakes, red as dried blood. Each motion was slow, deliberate. Scrape, wipe, breathe. Again, and again. The rhythm of endurance. A kind of prayer made of sweat and metal. The rust didn't give up easily. It clung to every surface like memory to old pain. But Thomas had learned long ago, nothing truly gone stays gone. You just have to keep showing up. By noon, his hands were raw. Blisters burst, blood streaked across the steel. He didn't stop. The ache became part of the sound. Scrape, wipe, breathe. He paused only once, to watch the sun slide across the sky. The same sun that burned his crops now gleamed on the patches he'd cleaned. Tiny veins of silver glimmered through the rust. Proof that life still hid inside the carcass. Proof that he hadn't been wrong. The road nearby carried voices, laughter again. He could hear them faintly. A wagon rattled past. Two men slowed their horses to stare. What's he doing? Trying to polish his way into heaven. They laughed and rode on. Thomas didn't look up. He had no time for ghosts with living tongues. The only voice that mattered was the scrape of the brush. The whisper of iron waking. That night he sat on the barn step, hands trembling. Lantern light flickered across his face. He held up the brush, bristles bent, handle blackened. The smell of oil clung to him like second skin. He whispered into the night, "We are getting there." The days began to form a rhythm. Dawn in the fields, dusk with the machine. Neighbors passed and muttered that he'd lost his sense. Even his sister came once, bringing bread and worry. "Tom, you can't eat rust," she said softly. "You can't live off dreams." He smiled faintly. Dreams? No. But maybe off proof. She sighed, left the bread, and went home shaking her head. By the time she reached the road, Thomas was already back at work. Weeks passed. The machine began to change, not for others, but for him. The texture of the steel was different now, less brittle, more alive. When he tapped it with his hammer, it no longer gave a dull thud. It rang, faint but clear, like a bell buried under dirt. The sound startled him the first time it came. He froze, breath held, waiting to hear it again. He tapped once more. There it was, a heartbeat in the metal. Quiet, shy, but real. He stepped back, staring at the locomotive. The lantern behind him threw long shadows across its body. It looked different now, not dead, just resting. Waiting. He cleaned his tools, oiled the bolts he could still turn. Every screw, every joint, a lesson in patience. Every scar, a map of what endurance looks like. At the market, the whispers grew sharper. Men smirked when he entered. "Tom Hale and his iron bride," one said. Another added, "He'll talk to it next." They didn't know he already did. In the quiet hours, he spoke to it like an old friend. Not out loud, not really. But the thoughts were there, shaped like words in his mind. You've seen worse, haven't you? Storms. Snow. Time. We'll get you breathing again. He felt foolish sometimes. Then he remembered, fools build what wise men laugh at. By late summer, the patches of bare steel had begun to connect. Lines of silver shimmered in the dusk like veins beneath skin. The brush no longer screamed. It sang. That evening, as the light died behind the hills, Thomas stepped back. For the first time, he saw not a wreck, but the beginning of a resurrection. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. His hands were cracked, his back screaming. But inside, a strange calm. The kind a man feels when the impossible starts to blink. He hung the brush on a nail in the barn wall. The lantern flame trembled in the draught. Outside, crickets hummed, and from somewhere deep within the boiler, a soft echo answered. A low metallic sigh. Alive. Thomas smiled. The prayer had been heard. By the time autumn brushed the valley gold, the laughter had dulled. People still whispered, but not with the same sharpness. They could sense something changing, not just in the machine, but in the man who worked beside it. Thomas no longer heard their voices at all. His world had narrowed to the clang of steel, the smell of oil, the faint ring that lived inside the metal. He rose before sunrise, fed the animals, checked the fields, and when the chores were done, he crossed the yard to the locomotive, like a priest walking to his altar. The first cold mornings brought mist. The air tasted of smoke and frost. The giant of iron stood half-cleaned, its sides streaked with scars and new polish. It looked wounded, but alive. And in that half-light, Thomas sometimes imagined it breathing. He climbed into the cab, a hollow space filled with silence and cobwebs. The floor creaked under his boots. The levers were frozen, their joints fused by years of neglect. He gripped one and pulled. Nothing. He tried again. Harder. The lever resisted, then shifted by the width of a breath. The sound was tiny, but to Thomas, it felt like the world had moved. He whispered, "You're still in there." That night, he brought a small forge into the barn. An anvil, a hammer, scrap iron scavenged from wagons and plows. He worked by lantern light, shaping the broken into the useful. Plow blades became brackets. Old hinges became bolts. Each spark that leapt into the air was a heartbeat of progress. His hands remembered the rhythm, long before his mind understood the craft. He was not a machinist. He was a farmer. But persistence makes its own knowledge. When a piece cracked, he welded another. When the measurements failed, he adjusted by instinct. It wasn't perfect, but it fit. And it held. Days passed. Nights blurred. His muscles ached in places he never knew existed. Yet when the lanterns went out, he felt no exhaustion, only hunger for tomorrow. The valley watched. Some nights, neighbors saw his forge glowing red inside the barn. They said it was the light of madness. But others started to wonder. One boy, maybe 10 years old, stood by the fence one evening, watching in silence. Thomas noticed him only when the boy spoke. "Is it gonna run again, mister?" Thomas looked up from the sparks. "Someday," he said. "Machines die, don't they?" the boy asked. Thomas smiled. "Only when people stop listening." The boy nodded solemnly and ran off. Thomas turned back to the fire. The hammer sang louder that night. He began learning the language of the boiler, its clicks, its groans, its subtle protests. He could tell when the metal was hungry for oil, or when a valve was ready to give. Every sound was a syllable. Every vibration, a sentence. Sometimes, late at night, he spoke to it in a whisper. "You carried dreams once. You'll do it again." The books he found in town helped a little. Old manuals, greasy and torn, with diagrams drawn by men long dead. He read them by the stove, tracing the lines with rough fingers, learning where the heart of the machine truly lived. He rebuilt the regulator valve. He replaced the seals around the piston rods. When the wrench slipped and tore his palm, he wrapped it in cloth and kept working. Blood and oil mixed, marking the metal like a signature. Every bolt he turned was a small defiance. Every gear he cleaned, a quiet declaration of faith. There were moments when despair tried to whisper, when nothing fit, when the tools broke, when exhaustion blurred his eyes. But then he would hear that sound, the faint ring deep inside the boiler, like something old trying to speak. He'd stop, listen, and smile again. Weeks folded into months. The nights grew longer. Frost painted the windows white. But in the barn, the heat of work never faded. One evening, as he tightened a set of bolts near the firebox, something happened. He struck the wrench against the steel, and the echo that came back was clear, resonant, alive. It filled the space like a note held by a choir. Thomas froze. Lantern light shimmered on his face. He struck again, softer this time. The same tone answered him. It wasn't just metal anymore. It was voice. He whispered, "You remember, don't you?" The air seemed to vibrate in reply. Outside, wind rattled the dry corn stalks. The valley slept. But in that barn, something had awakened. He sat on the step afterward, watching his breath curl in the cold air. The forge glowed behind him. The machine before him shimmered with faint light. For the first time, he felt less alone. He wasn't just repairing a locomotive. He was rebuilding faith. In work, in silence, in the stubborn music of effort. And though no one else could hear it yet, the iron was learning to sing again. The first breath never comes easy. It hides behind smoke, sweat, and silence. Thomas knew that. Still, he waited for it, day after day, as a man waits for rain in a season of drought. By late winter, the air itself felt brittle. Frost crawled along the barn walls. Tools froze to his fingers. Even the cows had stopped lowing at dawn. But the machine stood patient, its shadow stretching long across the yard like a promise. Thomas had cleaned every pipe he could reach. Bolts replaced, seals tightened, bearings oiled. What he couldn't restore, he rebuilt. And what he couldn't rebuild, he prayed over. Tonight, it was time. He stacked wood in the firebox. Dry pine, split oak, a handful of kindling soaked in kerosene. His lantern threw trembling light across the metal ribs. He could see his reflection in the clean steel. Thin, weathered, determined. The match struck. A spark. A flicker. Then flame. The sound filled the barn. Soft at first, like a sigh from a sleeping giant. Then louder. Crackling. Hungry. Alive. He fed it slowly. Hands steady. Breathing with the rhythm of the fire. The warmth spread through the boiler's belly, waking echoes that hadn't stirred in decades. When he opened the pressure gauge, nothing moved. Not yet. He waited. Minutes stretched. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the cold. Then, a hiss. A single, trembling note. Thin steam escaping through a crack along the side. It twisted into the air like ghost's breath. Thomas froze. Eyes wide. Chest tight. There it was. Life. He laughed once. A dry, broken sound that startled even him. He stepped closer. Placed his palm on the warm metal. It pulsed faintly under his touch, like a heartbeat long forgotten. Outside, the wind rattled the dry stalks of corn. Dogs barked somewhere down the road. But inside the barn, the only sound was the whisper of returning strength. Thomas turned the valve a fraction. The hiss deepened. A thread of steam curled upward and kissed the rafters. He shut it quickly. Too much pressure could kill the dream in a heartbeat. But the machine had spoken. He sat back on the workbench, lantern flickering beside him, and watched the ghostly mist drift through the light. It looked almost holy. Not man-made, reborn. By dawn, the fire had died down to embers. The iron was cooling again, but the memory of warmth lingered in the air. Thomas leaned his head against the steel. "You're breathing," he whispered. "And so am I." Word spread fast, not because he told anyone, but because the valley noticed the smoke. A black column rising from his field, curling into the pale morning sky. They laughed first, of course. They always did. Old Hale's burning junk to keep warm. Maybe he's summoning ghosts again. But beneath the laughter, there was unease, curiosity. That evening, 2 neighbors came riding up the road. They stopped at the fence, pretending they weren't watching. Thomas heard them whisper, "You think he's got it working?" Working? That pile of scrap? No chance. Still, they didn't leave. They watched until dark, until Thomas stoked the fire again. And the hiss returned, louder this time. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. Every sound inside the boiler drowned their voices out. The machine coughed once. Metal popped under pressure. Steam burst from the side vents in ragged puffs. The old pipe screamed. But they held. Thomas adjusted the feed. More air. More fire. More life. He could feel the vibration through the floorboards now. A faint trembling under his boots. He smiled through the heat and smoke. "You're remembering," he said softly. "And so am I." Hours passed before the fire dwindled again. When at last he shut the valves, the barn was thick with the scent of oil, ash, and victory. He sat on the cold ground, back against the wheel. breathing in rhythm with the cooling machine. Outside, the moon had risen. The frost glittered on the rails like silver veins. In that stillness, the valley seemed to sleep unaware that something ancient had stirred. The next morning, the preacher mentioned pride in his sermon. He spoke of men who chased vanity, who built idols of smoke and fire. Everyone in the pews nodded. And yet, when they left the church, they looked toward the distant field, where a thin trail of steam still climbed into the sky. By nightfall, Thomas had already lit the fire again. He worked the valves, watched the gauge quiver, listened to the hissing grow steady. He didn't need anyone's blessing. He had found something holier than approval, the sound of persistence turning into proof. When the last log cracked and split, a new tone echoed inside the boiler. Not a hiss this time, a hum. Low, steady, alive. Thomas stepped back, lantern raised, eyes shining in the glow of the awakening beast. For a moment, he could swear he saw the metal breathe. The first breath was complete, and it would not be the last. The rains stopped coming. At first, nobody panicked. The valley had known dry spells before, but this one stayed. Week after week, the sky turned to brass. Clouds drifted by like ghosts, pale, empty, silent. The fields yellowed. The wells dropped. The creeks shrank to ribbons of dust. And the laughter that once followed Thomas Hale now dried up with the riverbeds. Every day the sun rose meaner than the last. Horses wheezed in their stalls. Children coughed from dust in their throats. Even the wind grew tired of moving. Thomas watched it all from his porch. He'd lived through drought before, but never one that felt this final. This one tasted like judgment. Still, when the air cooled each evening, he walked to the barn. The locomotive waited there, silent no more, its steel belly marked with soot, its boiler scarred but strong. He had kept feeding it, tending it, listening to it breathe. Now, it breathed louder. That night, he shoveled in coal. The firebox roared. The pipe shook. Pressure built. Steam curled thick and white into the air. The barn trembled. And then, it happened. A whistle. Faint. Cracked. But real. It split the silence of the valley, like a scream of life from the throat of the dead. Dogs barked in the distance. Cattle lifted their heads. Men stepped out onto porches, eyes scanning the horizon for the source. And there, from the lonely farm on the hill, rose a tower of smoke and sound. Thomas laughed, quietly, but with fire in his chest. The beast had found its voice. After all the rust, after all the ridicule, it could finally sing. He stayed awake till dawn, listening to the hiss and hum, the rhythm of life pulsing through the pipes. It was imperfect, broken in tone, but it was music all the same. By morning, people began to talk. Did you hear it last night? That noise sounded like a train. Can't be. He'd need miracles for that thing to move. No one mentioned the thirst in their throats, the cracks in their soil. They laughed again, but this time it was brittle, forced, like trying to smile with sand in your mouth. As days stretched into burning weeks, the valley started to break. The wells turned to mud. The cattle grew thin. Mothers rationed water to children. Men argued at the square over who still had enough to share. And through it all, Thomas worked. Not for pride now, for purpose. He had discovered something deep under his land months before. A trickle of water hidden in rock and clay. Barely a spring, but steady. Enough for one man. Or for many, if carried far. He began building again. A flat car, old planks, iron braces, wagon wheels. A crude platform behind the locomotive. Room for barrels. Room for hope. Every night, the whistle called across the valley. And every morning, the fire burned hotter. The engine that had been mocked as useless now glowed with power. It didn't yet move, not fully, but it trembled like it wanted to, like it remembered how. One evening, George rode out to see him. The laughter was gone from his face. His voice was rough, his throat dry. "Tom, you still got that spring." Thomas nodded. "You got water." "I've got enough to try." George looked past him, to the machine looming in the dusk, smoke curling from its stack. You really think that thing can help us? Thomas didn't answer right away. He touched the boiler, felt the pulse of warmth through the steel. I think, he said softly, it's been waiting for a reason. The next morning, he filled the barrels. He stoked the fire. He checked the valves one last time. His hands were steady. His heartbeat was not. Neighbors gathered by the fence. They didn't laugh now. They just stared. Hungry, silent, afraid. Thomas climbed into the cab. Steam hissed around him. The gauge trembled. The ground vibrated. He gripped the lever. Pulled. A deep, grinding groan rolled through the valley. Metal screamed against rust. Sparks spat from the wheels. And then, a jolt. Movement. The locomotive lurched forward. Slow, stubborn, magnificent. The barrels behind it swayed and clattered. Water slushing like waves in the desert. Men gasped. Children shouted. Women covered their mouths. The road filled with dust and disbelief. For the first time in decades, the engine rolled beneath the open sky. Steam poured from its stack in proud, furious clouds. And with every hiss, it defied every laugh ever thrown at it. Thomas guided it down the old, forgotten stretch of track. Rusty rails, warped but waiting. He drove it toward the dry heart of the valley, where the people needed it most. Behind him, the whistle blew again. Louder this time, fuller, alive. The sound carried across the fields, like a sermon of redemption. Children ran after it, their bare feet kicking up dust. Old men lifted their hats, tears mixing with sweat on their faces. Even the preacher stopped at his door, listening to the whistle fade into the wind. The valley didn't laugh anymore. It listened. And in that listening, something began to change. Not just in the air, but in the hearts that had mocked and doubted. A machine once called a coffin had become a messenger. Its voice, the first sound of hope, in a land that had forgotten how to pray. The road had forgotten him. The rails had forgotten themselves. But steel remembers, if you remind it gently enough. Thomas Hale stood at dawn, shovel in hand. The valley lay quiet, waiting. Dust hung like fog, soft and gold in the morning light. The locomotive rested in the field behind him, its flanks streaked with soot and victory. It had moved. It had spoken. And now it hungered for more. He walked the length of the old track. What remained of it? Weeds had claimed most of the ties. Sections had vanished under years of soil and indifference. Yet the bones were still there. Warped. Bent. But alive. Thomas knelt. Scraped away dirt from a buried rail. The metal glinted faintly beneath the rust. He smiled. Still here, he murmured. You waited. That day began the rebuilding. Not with machinery. With hands. With will. He lifted sleepers with crowbars. Hammered spikes by hand until his palm split open. Measured by eye, guessed by feel. The rhythm of work became the only music he knew. Clang. Clang. Silence. Clang again. Children came first, curious and shy. They watched from a distance, barefoot, whispering among themselves. Then one boy brought a bucket of nails. A girl carried a rag to wipe sweat from his brow. Soon, others joined. By dusk, a small army worked beside him. Men, women, old folks who hadn't swung a hammer in years. No one had asked them. They just came. The valley had begun to remember too. Every spike driven was an act of defiance. Every tie placed, a small resurrection. They rebuilt not just a track, but the thing that laughter had almost killed. Belief. The engine watched, silent but alive. At night, Thomas lit its firebox. The soft glow spilled across the field, painting faces orange and gold. Steam drifted into the cool sky like breath after prayer. The people worked by that light. Their shadows long, their voices low. No songs, no speeches. Just the quiet music of effort shared. When they paused to rest, someone always asked the same question. Will it go farther this time? Thomas's answer never changed. As far as it needs to. Days turned into weeks. The line stretched farther across the valley floor, an iron scar mending an old wound. Each morning the sun rose red, and the rails gleamed under it like veins of fire. But not everyone rejoiced. Virgil Moore watched from a distance. His wells were nearly dry now. His control slipping through his fingers. Where people once came begging for water, they now followed the whistle. His power was fading with every puff of steam. One evening, he rode out to the site. Dust followed his horse like smoke. He stopped near the edge of the new track. "Tom," he called, "you're leading people into trouble." Thomas straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Into water," he said quietly. Moore's jaw tightened. "You think this toy will save you? The land's dying. Hale. You'll just die slower." Thomas looked past him, to where the horizon shimmered with heat. "Then I'll die working." He turned and swung the hammer again. Moore watched a moment longer, then spurred his horse and vanished into the dust. That night, Thomas sat beside the locomotive. The fire crackled inside the furnace. Sparks climbed toward the stars. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "They're starting to believe. That's the hardest part." The machine gave a low groan, as if it understood. Metal cooling, sighing. In the distance, the valley flickered with lanterns. Families camped near the new rails. Too tired to go home. Too hopeful to stop watching. They had no sermons left. No faith in rain. Only in the whistle that now called like a heartbeat through the dust. By dawn, the work began again. Thomas climbed into the cab. Shoveled coal. Fed the fire. The gauge trembled. The ground beneath the rails began to hum. He released the brake. The wheels turned once, twice, then caught. The locomotive rolled forward. Slow but steady, pulling its cargo of barrels and hearts behind it. Children ran beside it, faces shining with dust and joy. Men walked ahead, checking the line, guiding the way. It was no longer his machine alone. It belonged to them all now, to the valley that had once mocked and now moved with him. As the train crawled over the rebuilt rails, the sound echoed against the hills, a thunder made of hope and iron. From the distance, the preacher watched in silence. He bowed his head and whispered, "Maybe this is what faith looks like." The whistle blew, long, low, steady. The valley listened. And in that sound, the earth itself seemed to breathe again. The track had remembered. And so had they. By the time the first water train rolled, the valley had stopped pretending it wasn't desperate. Dust no longer just covered the ground. It lived in the lungs. The air burned to breathe. Children cried without tears. The cattle no longer lifted their heads. And yet, when the whistle blew that morning, people came. They came from every ridge, every farm. Their wagons creaking, their buckets empty. Their hope thin as paper, but still alive. They gathered near the fence at Thomas Hale's land. A crowd of faces drawn tight by hunger and heat. The locomotive stood behind him, hissing softly, a living monument of rust and grace. Thomas didn't speak much. He didn't need to. He pointed to the barrels, lined and ready on the flat car. He dipped his ladle, poured water into the first jug. A small stream of silver against all that brown and dust. A child gasped. The sound alone broke the silence. Then came a rush forward. Not chaos, but need. "Easy," Thomas said gently. "Everyone will get their share." He kept his word. Barrel after barrel. Jug after jug. Hand after trembling hand. No payment. No pride. Just water. The crowd moved slowly, quietly, as if inside a church. Only the sound of buckets clinking. The whisper of pouring. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A woman wept openly, clutching a cup to her chest as if it were a relic. An old man fell to his knees and kissed the wet dirt. No one laughed anymore. Not a soul. By noon, the sun was merciless again. But the people stayed. Some brought their children to see the machine, to touch the warm iron with small hands. Thomas smiled faintly, nodded to them, and stoked the fire again. He didn't call it charity. He didn't call it God's work. He called it necessary. When someone offered coins, he shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "You'll need it when it rains." But deep inside, he wondered if it ever would. From the ridge above, Virgil Moore watched. His horse pawed the dirt impatiently, mirroring his anger. The wells on his land had nearly gone dry. The men he once commanded now stood in line below, taking water from the fool he had mocked. Pride is heavy, and envy burns hotter than sun. He rode down in the afternoon, dust billowing around him. The crowd parted. He stopped near the engine, his voice hard, controlled. "Tom," he said, "you're creating a problem." Thomas turned slowly, eyes calm, hands blackened with soot. "Am I?" Moore gestured at the people. "They're depending on you. You can't keep this up. What happens when the spring runs dry? When the fire dies?" Thomas looked out over the faces in line. Faces that had once laughed, now waiting with quiet faith. "I'll find another way," he said simply. Moore sneered. "You think this is salvation? It's chaos waiting to happen. This water should be managed, by the council, by the church, by someone responsible." Thomas's voice was soft. "Responsibility starts with thirst." For a moment, silence fell between them. Only the hiss of steam filled the air. Then Moore's jaw tightened. He turned his horse. "This won't last," he muttered. And he rode away. The people watched him leave. But no one followed. They turned back to the man who gave freely. That night, when the last bucket was filled, Thomas sat beside the locomotive. The firebox glowed like a sunset trapped in steel. He rubbed a hand across his forehead, leaving streaks of ash. His sister brought him bread and a jar of beans. "You can't feed everyone," she said softly. "I can try," he answered. She looked at him for a long moment. "What made you do it? All of this?" He didn't answer right away. He watched the steam curl up into the dark sky. Slow, graceful, endless. "Because I know what it feels like," he said finally. "To need something nobody believes in." The whistle blew once, long and low. Its sound drifting out across the dry land. The people still camped nearby lifted their heads. Some smiled. Some cried. But all of them listened. The valley had found a new kind of prayer. Not words. Not hymns. Just silence. The silence stronger than apologies. The next morning, the line formed again. No shouting. No pushing. Just gratitude. They brought Thomas gifts he didn't ask for. A loaf of bread, a bundle of corn, a mended coat. Small things. But each one carried meaning. A thank you too humble for words. And when he looked at the faces, the same faces that once laughed behind his back, he felt no bitterness, only peace, and a quiet knowing that soon, this peace would be tested. The whistle called again at sunset, and far on the ridge, Virgil Moore watched, his eyes cold, calculating. He wasn't done, and neither was the drought. The whistle had become the sound of hope, and hope, to some men, is more dangerous than drought. Virgil Moore could no longer sleep. Every night the sound reached his house on the hill. That long, low cry from Hale's machine. It echoed through his walls like a reminder that power was slipping away. He poured whiskey into his glass, watched the moonlight cut across the rim, and whispered to no one, "He's turning them against me." The next morning, Thomas woke before dawn as always. The air smelled of dust and iron. He walked to the locomotive, hands steady, mind calm. Steam still whispered faintly from the pipes. Everything seemed as it should be, until he turned the valve. A sharp hiss. Wrong. Too sudden. Too strong. He stepped back. Steam shot out from a crack joint, hissing like a snake ready to strike. Thomas shut it down immediately. Pressure dropped. The firebox sighed. He wiped sweat and soot from his forehead. Knelt, examined the seam. The bolt was loose. Not worn. Not broken. Loosened. His heart slowed. Not fear, recognition. Someone had touched his machine. He tightened the joint. Checked the rest of the fittings. Another loose bolt. A pipe half blocked with sand. And the grease line, clogged. Sabotage. He sat back on the dirt, staring at the machine that had become his life. The one thing he trusted had been wounded by unseen hands. He didn't call for help. Didn't shout or curse. He just sat there for a long time, listening to the cooling metal whisper in the dawn. By sunrise, the first wagons arrived. People waiting for water. Smiling, waving, unaware. Thomas forced a small smile in return. "Give me a bit," he said. "Just need to fix a few things." He worked through the morning. His movements precise, deliberate. Every bolt checked. Every pipe opened and cleaned. Every gasket replaced. Each repair felt like an act of faith, a quiet promise that no darkness would stop what he built. By noon, he had it running again. The whistle blew. Water poured. The people cheered. But behind his calm eyes, Thomas saw a shadow forming on the edge of the crowd. Moore watched from his horse. No words this time. Just a stare. Cold. Sharp. Measuring. That night, Thomas kept the lanterns burning. He circled the locomotive again and again. Checking, tightening, guarding. The air hummed with tension. The silence heavy enough to taste. Sometime after midnight, he heard it. The crunch of footsteps outside the barn. Slow. Careful. He reached for the wrench near the workbench. Waited. The footsteps paused. A faint creak. Someone near the fuel barrels. Thomas moved silently. Lantern low, shadows long. He saw a figure crouched beside the firebox. A man in a long coat. Hand twisting a valve. "Don't," Thomas said quietly. The man froze. Turned. It wasn't Moore, just one of his men. A hired hand from the ridge. Face pale, eyes wide. "Mr. Moore said it was dangerous," the man stammered. "Said it might explode. I was just leaving," Thomas said. His voice was calm, but in the lantern light, his shadow looked enormous. The man stumbled back, nearly tripping over the barrels, then fled into the dark. Thomas watched until the footsteps faded. Then he sat beside the machine. The fire inside had dimmed to coals. He fed it again. Slowly, deliberately. Each log a vow. "You'll not die by their fear," he murmured. "Not while I'm breathing." By morning, word spread fast. Someone had tried to damage the water engine. The valley buzzed with anger. Men came armed, ready to guard the farm. Thomas refused them. "This isn't a war," he said. But the look in his eyes said otherwise. He spent the next days strengthening every joint, reinforcing every pipe. The machine became a fortress, a monument to endurance. Even Moore's allies began to hesitate. Whispers shifted. Maybe Hale's not the fool after all. Maybe he's the only one who hasn't given up. The preacher came one afternoon, hat in hand, eyes heavy. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About pride. About you." Thomas only nodded. Then he looked toward the horizon, where thunderheads were starting to form. Dark, distant, uncertain. "Maybe the sky's ready to forgive," he said. That evening, the firebox burned hotter than ever. Thomas shoveled coal until sweat soaked his shirt. He wanted the hiss, the roar, the life inside the metal to drown out every doubt. The whistle cried again. Not weak, not cracked, but fierce and defiant. Its voice rolled across the valley, rattling windows, shaking hearts. In the distance, Virgil Moore stood on the ridge, watching the smoke curl into the coming storm. His face was pale, his eyes burning with something colder than hate. Fear. The valley now stood with Hale, and the machine they had once mocked had become too loud to silence. The valley gathered under a white, pitiless sun. No clouds, no wind, only the taste of dust and judgment in the air. Word had spread faster than the drought itself. There would be a meeting, a decision, a reckoning. At the church square, wagons circled like tired cattle. Men stood in clusters, whispering. Women fanned their children with cracked palms. And at the center, Virgil Moore, standing tall on the steps, his coat spotless, his hat shadowing eyes that hid fire. Behind him, the preacher. Behind the preacher, silence. Thomas arrived last. He came on foot, boots caked in dust, hands black with oil and soot. No crowd greeted him. No applause. Just a long, uneasy hush that followed him like a shadow. He stopped a few paces away, his eyes on Moore, his voice calm but heavy with weight. "You called this meeting," he said. "I came." Moore's smile was the kind men wear before drawing a knife. "Thomas Hale," he began, voice smooth as cold water. "You've done remarkable things. You brought water when none could. You gave hope when it was dying. For that, the valley thanks you." The crowd murmured, uncertain, expectant. Then Moore's tone hardened. "But one man cannot control the life of many. This machine, this engine of yours, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people." The preacher nodded slowly, his hands trembling over the worn Bible. "It's a gift," he said, "and gifts must be shared." Thomas said nothing. The silence stretched until even the crows fell quiet. Moore stepped closer. "Turn it over, Tom. Let the council manage the water. Let us distribute it fairly. You'll still have your farm, your name, your peace." Thomas's gaze moved over the crowd. Faces he knew. Faces that had once laughed. Faces that had since lined up for water. Faces that now looked away. He could have shouted. Could have called them cowards. Instead, he spoke quietly. So quietly the wind had to lean in to hear. "I built it with my hands," he said. "When no one believed. When you all laughed." He looked directly at Moore. "You called it a coffin." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Moore's jaw tightened. "That's not the point." Thomas took a step forward. "The point," he said, "is who you serve, them or yourself." Moore's voice rose, sharp and polished. "I serve order. Without order, this valley dies." Thomas's voice stayed low. "Without heart, it's already dead." The crowd stirred again, torn between the two men, between fear and faith, between the man who had power for years, and the man who had given them water. An old woman spoke up from the back. Her voice cracked but strong. "My boy drank again because of him," she said, pointing to Thomas. Her finger shook. "But not because of you." Silence. A single cough. Then another voice, a man's this time. "He didn't take a coin from us. Didn't ask for anything." Others nodded. Small nods. Quiet, unsure, but growing. Moore saw it. He felt control slipping. His words came faster, harder. "Don't be fooled. He means well, yes, but this idol of steam is dangerous. If that boiler bursts, half the valley goes with it. You think faith will save you from fire?" Thomas didn't move. He waited until the echo of Moore's words died. Then he said softly, "Faith built it. Fire keeps it alive. You can fear it, or you can trust it." He turned toward the people, the ones he had carried water to, the ones who had touched the warmth of iron and hope. "Decide," he said, "right now." The preacher swallowed hard. He looked from Moore to Thomas, then to the faces before him. "Let those who stand with Thomas step forward," he said. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then a child did. Barefoot, holding a dented tin cup. She stood beside Thomas without a word. Her mother followed. Then an old farmer. Then 2 men from the ridge. Then dozens more, until half the square stood behind him. And the rest watched in silence. Moore's face twisted. Disbelief, anger. The realization that his valley was no longer his. He turned sharply to the preacher. "This is madness." The preacher shook his head. "No," he said softly. "This is faith." The sound of the whistle broke the moment. Low, steady, rolling across the valley like thunder without rain. Every head turned toward the horizon, where the locomotive stood in the distance, its smoke rising black against the sky. It waited. Alive. Thomas met Moore's eyes one last time. "Order won't save them," he said. "Water will." He walked away then. Through the dust. Through the murmurs. Back toward the field that had become his sanctuary. Behind him, the people followed. By sunset, the church square was empty, and the only sound left was the whistle, long and defiant, echoing across the dying valley. That night, the first lightning in months cracked across the horizon. The smell of ozone drifted through the air. Some said it was a warning. Thomas thought it sounded more like a promise. The sky broke before dawn. Not softly. Not kindly. It tore itself open with a roar that rolled over the valley like judgment. Thunder. Real thunder. After months of silence, lightning flashed on the horizon, splitting the dark with veins of white fire. Thomas woke to the sound and sat up fast. For a moment, he thought it was another dream. Then he heard it. The hiss of rain against the roof. Light. Sparse. Then harder. He laughed, a deep, shaking laugh that filled the empty house. Outside, the wind howled across the fields. Dust turned to mud under his boots as he ran to the barn. The first drops hit the locomotive's steel skin with a sound like applause. He touched the metal, feeling it tremble under the cold rain. "You did it," he whispered. "We called it back." But the joy didn't last long. By midday, the rain became fury. The dry ground couldn't drink it fast enough. Water raced down the hills in muddy rivers, flooding the low roads, tearing through fences. What the drought hadn't taken, the flood threatened to finish. Thomas climbed into the cab. He'd spent half his life fighting too much of something. Too much sun, too much laughter, too much doubt. Now it was too much water. The people needed help again. The same people who once mocked, who now looked to the man with the machine. Lanterns glowed through the downpour. Wagons stuck in rising mud. Children crying on rooftops. The valley was drowning in its own salvation. Thomas pulled open the firebox door. Rain hissed against the flames. But the coal caught. He fed it with dry wood from the loft. Hands slick with rain and ash. The boiler groaned. Alive once more. The whistle cut through the storm. A cry against chaos. A call to gather. The sound carried for miles. Men and women turned toward it, wading through the flood, their faces lit by flashes of lightning. He guided the locomotive forward. The rails shone silver under the rain. Half buried, half lost, but still holding. Each turn of the wheel sent up sprays of mud and sparks. The valley watched. Awestruck again, Thomas shouted orders to those who came running. Load the flat car. Barrels, ropes, boards, anything that floats. They obeyed without question. Fear and faith moved faster than speech. Together they dragged people from the low farms, hauled livestock onto higher ground, carried food, blankets, life itself. The machine roared through the storm. A beast of iron and mercy. The preacher arrived drenched, coat plastered to his back. He climbed into the cab beside Thomas. "Need another pair of hands," he said simply. Thomas nodded. Together they kept the fire alive, shoveling, steering, watching the pressure gauge tremble. The sound of rain on steel became music. Fierce, wild, holy. Hours passed in chaos. Bridges washed away. Fences vanished. But the engine kept moving. The whistle never stopped. Then came the worst moment. The track ahead sagged where the flood had torn the earth apart. A gap, just wide enough to end everything. Thomas saw it too late. He slammed the brake. The wheels screamed. The machine shuddered to a halt inches before the collapse. Steam roared from every seam. The ground beneath them trembled. For a heartbeat, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. Then the preacher's voice. Steady, clear through the storm. "We build again." Thomas jumped down into the water. Knee-deep, cold, violent. He shouted for men. Grabbed timbers, iron rods, chains. They worked in lightning flashes. Hammering, wedging, binding. Hands bled. Muscles screamed. But no one stopped. The locomotive's fire still burned. Its light glowed across their faces, orange against the endless grey. When the makeshift rails were finally stable, Thomas climbed back into the cab. The preacher looked at him, eyes full of fear and faith. "It'll hold," Thomas said. "Because it has to." He eased the lever forward. The engine groaned, wheels turning slow. The whole frame shaking as it crossed the broken ground. For a second, the left wheel slipped. Sank. Caught again. A cheer rose behind him, swallowed by thunder. They made it. The engine crawled onto solid track. The whistle blew once more. A sound not of warning, but of victory. By morning, the storm began to fade. The sky cracked open, revealing a strip of pale gold on the horizon. The valley shimmered. Muddy, battered, alive. Families stood outside. Faces lifted to the light. Rain still dripped from rooftops, but now it sounded like peace. Thomas shut down the boiler. Let the fire die slowly. Steam curled from the stack, thin and soft as breath after prayer. He leaned against the side of the locomotive, exhausted, soaked, smiling faintly. The preacher stood beside him. "You gave them water," he said. "And hope," Thomas replied. "That's rarer." Virgil Moore came riding down the road. His coat was torn, his hat gone. He dismounted, stood silently for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Thomas hesitated, then took it. No words. No forgiveness asked. None needed. The sun broke through at last. Light touched the rails, turning them to rivers of fire. Children ran through puddles, laughing again. The sound was music. Thomas looked up at the sky. Blue returning, clouds drifting west. He whispered, "We did it." The locomotive stood behind him, silent but alive, steam sighing softly from its heart. Not a monument now, a memory, a promise. When night fell, the valley glowed with lanterns. The fields glistened under stars for the first time in months. And from far away, carried on the wind, came one last whistle. Low, gentle, eternal. The valley had learned to listen. And the rain, finally, had remembered its way home.